we're just going to give about 5 minutes for the most for those who are in the cafe to come in. They were getting books signed. I remember one year I was playing Mass in Trinidad. It was Carnival Tuesday afternoon. I think it was 3 o'clock or something like that. The sun was not as high in the sky as it is at 12 noon, but it was obvious that the day was coming to an end. And I started to cry. And I kind of get it. And then a little later in the day, we bounce up Exodus, which is a steel pan, and they are on the road on Carnival Tuesday. And I chipped with them for a little while, and they were playing the last strains of The Carnival Is Over by Lord Kitchener. I was so overcome with emotion because for the 2 days, and they jokingly call me Carnival Marsha. That's my alter ego, I promise. Just everything that I had held in me for the entire year gets released at Carnival, and as a Trinidadian, you know, it's just part of who we are. But anyway, so they're playing the last strains of Lord Kitchener's The Carnival Is Over on steel pan, acoustic, nothing else but a steel pan, and it was the most, some people say that I'm modeling, it was the most intense emotional experience that I had. And the point is, when you hear the carnival is over, well, the thing almost done, and that's kind of how I feel at this halfway mark on day 3, because this is 2 of 4. And the stories that we're going to talk about and we're going to hear about lean into our ancestral memory, lean into like some really tough and it explores some various, from various perspectives, relationships that we have with our mothers. It talks about healing, simply because of how we came to be in the Caribbean. That could be a sore point or a touchy topic. A lot of us, even if you're not a Caribbean person, and can we just shout out for a little bit, Camille U. Adams, her book, How to Be Unmothered, began this thread. Her book opened the pre-festival event for Brooklyn Caribbean Literary Festival 2025, where we explored this theme of mothering. And it seems like for us, from a programming point of view, that's something that simply can't let us go. As I was saying, sort of because of how we've come to be. And I don't think you have to be a Caribbean person either to understand or to be able to identify the fraught relationships that we often have with our mothers. When we were assembling this panel, we were trying to think of, well, what are the ways that we can explore, how can we talk about this topic of healing from non-linear perspectives as Caribbean people, because that's why you all are here at the Brooklyn Caribbean Literary Festival. Plants have a lot to do with healing. We wanted to explore this concept from various angles and from various narratives. And it really, after we considered all of the books that would make it on the panel, all of the writers that we would talk about that would be full-bodied and a wide perspective, I think we distilled it down to the question of what does it mean to return to yourself when the path has been buried? And the title of this event is Root Voice Memory on Plants, Mothers, and Making Ourselves Whole. Our guest authors today, Donna Hemans, Aleya Fraser, and Kaitlyn Greenidge, they are a herbalist, Aleya, 2 novelists, and our literary host, Lauren Francis Sharma, will explore through their narratives how plants, memory, and story help us to hold what feels too complex to fit. And if you didn't recognize already, I think this festival is a response to the turbulent times that we are living in right now, whether they are political, whatever's going on with us internally. Sometimes it feels like the pace of this world is just too fast. It's too frenetic, and we don't have a moment to breathe and think through. The devices and the technology that we've come to rely on can also be it can be jarring. We had a little snafu yesterday during Cheryl's event. I don't know if you all realized it, and I was totally not supposed to talk about the things that go wrong, but the digital age and the fast pace of this age sometimes feels like our vessels cannot hold everything. I know that to be true of me. And for us, story is where we get to displace the rest of it. Story is where we get to figure out what we cannot understand ourselves. So Aleya Fraser, in her book, collection, Caribbean Herbalism, she turns to ancestral plant knowledge as cultural memory and ecological balm. Kaitlyn Greenidge, her book Libertie, traces the silences placed passed between mothers and daughters and the radical act of forging a voice. And then Donna Heeman's two books, Tea by the Sea and House of Plain Truth. Donna tends to write fiction that excavates those fractured family ties, the lingering echo of separation, and the quiet determination to reclaim lost belonging. And Lauren Francis Sharma, who's leading the panel, her own work and she's a fiction writer, it navigates loss, longing, and the hard-won labor of becoming whole. And summarily, this conversation honors silence, vulnerability, and the sacredness of fracture. These artists, what we've noticed, what they have in common, is that they all refuse these neat narratives of healing. Their work names the anxiety that precedes growth, the grief that we find inside resilience, and the risk of loving anything in a collapsing world, the risk of loving anything too much. Their stories also teach us that it's okay to let go in the process of loving. Today, you may leave with some questions, because this was a prescription, and every prescription the doctor gives you to fix your problems, right? So we do not promise that we'll answer all of your questions, but we hope that you will leave with a few living tools. And think about the question that we began with: what does it mean to return to yourself when the path has been buried? This space will honor silence and the sacredness of fracture. We did not come here whole. I'm not asking you to leave here whole, but we are asking you to listen, to reflect, and to root, however imperfectly, in your own act of becoming. Would you please help me welcome our fantastic novelists for the 3 o'clock slot to the stage.
Welcome. So excited to have you all. I love this topic. I think it's going to be really, and I'm going to try to stick with the topic a little bit today and get us talking about all these things that Marsha, I don't know, Marsha must have had like 12 subjects that we need to cover up here. The first, I think, is like how stories heal us and what truths keep us rooted. How do we love in a collapsing world? I'm thinking a lot about that these days. So I really love the idea of talking about plants and mothers. And Kaitlyn, your book. Your book, Libertie, is about a young girl who learns homeopathy, right, at the skirt hem of her mother, a doctor, in the mid-1800s. Eventually, her mother's able to send her off to become a doctor. Libertie ends up marrying a doctor and moving to Haiti, where she soon realizes that being away from her mother makes for a slightly unhappy life. Yeah. The story is based on a true story. Can you talk about how you unearthed that story and what truths you wanted to emphasize?
Sure. So the story is based on Dr. Susan Smith McKinney-Steward, who is from here in Brooklyn. She was the daughter of one of the founders of Weeksville, which was a free Black community that was located in central Brooklyn, founded in 1838, and was sort of like a space of Black independence, Black self-determination in the US. And I had worked at the Weeksville Heritage Center, which is a museum in central Brooklyn that covers all of that history. And when I worked there, we did an oral history with one of Susan Smith McKinney's descendants, who was a woman who, she was a famous soap opera actress. So she herself sort of had written about her family in her own memoir. She was on a show called One Life to Live in the 70s and 80s. And she told this story, we're interviewing her about her family and her family history, which is their family has documented very, very well. And then she told us the story about Dr. Susan Smith McKinney's daughter, Anna, who married a man from Haiti and moved to Haiti. The marriage was abusive, and somehow the Dr. McKinney and Anna figured out how to exit that marriage in the early 20th century. So like a really rare occurrence. And their family has all these letters back and forth between the mother and daughter. And according to their family legend, when the daughter Anna left Haiti for the rest of her life, she would get these letters from from the family she had married into back in Haiti saying, "You're a terrible person. What you're doing is breaking up a family." They were sort of part of this black upper class that arose after Reconstruction. So for her to leave a marriage, it's a terrible thing for anybody, but in that case, they were so hyper aware of black representation. So it was sort of like, you are not only messing up this family, but you are messing up everything we've worked for as black upper class people, trying to prove that we are orderly and together and all these sorts of things, and you're breaking all that apart, and it's all on you. So that was like a really interesting thing as a novelist. So you're sort of like thinking there's so much like tension and interesting stuff there. And then when I was starting to actually write it, I decided to set it in the 1880s because, of course, as we know, like that time in US history, Reconstruction, is a direct mirror of our own time right now, when we're seeing sort of like a complete backlash against black gains. And we do have sort of like a generation of black people who have reached great heights in sort of everywhere, and there's this intense white cultural economic backlash against that. So I wanted to write about that, but not necessarily set in our own time, but set in the past.
I love that. I love this book so much.
Thank you.
Kaitlyn, you wrote, "The garden is no small thing to a homeopath. Mama kept a huge one to grow the most common things she needed: elderflower, ginger, mint, aloe." Then we see Libertie with a big black book of plant remedies, some of which you list. Aleya, your book, Caribbean Herbalism, Traditional Wisdom, and Modern Herbal Healing, is like an encyclopedia of remedies, much like the one Libertie carries around. Years of study and care and research have gone into this book, which I adore. I adore this book. You write, "The beauty of Caribbean herbal knowledge is that it lives in the people, and that plants are at the service of humankind in Caribbean plant-human relationship." What I see in both these books is this knowledge being passed down mostly through women. For many Black Americans and West Indian Americans, I see a larger gap between the way people live in relation to plants as compared to what our foremothers understood about plants and food. But Aleya, can you talk about your interest? You're, a relatively young woman, and you've decided that this is a thing and it's important to you. Can you talk about that?
Yeah. I first got interested in herbalism, as a young child, and it got deeper as an adult. But I grew up in the woods behind my backyard in Baltimore County. I was always, just playing in the woods and wanting to learn more about nature. And going back and forth to Trinidad as a child, we would go visit my grandmother in South Oropouche. I was in that generation where our parents shipped us off on planes without adults and sent us down there for the summer. And my grandmother also had that yard that you mentioned full of aloes and ratchet, which is a cactus, wonder of the world, shadow benny, all of the spices. And what I really always took away was that, for one, no one can be hungry because, your sister has mango, you have zabuka, like everyone's sharing the food, but also everyone is sharing the medicine. No one person was like the holder of all of that knowledge. And, you just knew who you had to go to get certain medicine or certain healing. And then fast forward, I thought I wanted to be a doctor, go to medical school, took the MCAT and all of that. And then I discovered farming as a way of life and a way of being. And for me, food as medicine was the entry point to that. And I'm out there farming on the eastern shore of Maryland. Kaitlyn actually interviewed my aunties. Speaking of, passing down knowledge through women. We're not related, but they take that auntie title very seriously, and that's what they do, is pass on knowledge to the next generation. and we were on the ancestral lands of Harriet Tubman. So that was a very powerful story of us reconnecting to the land in a place where Harriet Tubman had to flee from for her freedom. We're going back to that place for freedom. And while I'm out there growing sweet potatoes and tomatoes and onions, and we're weeding, that's when I started, really paying attention to these weeds. Like, what are they good for? Like, why am I wasting anything? And that's very ancestral too. We, as Caribbean people, we don't waste anything. So I'm pulling up lamb's quarter and dandelion and, talking to my elders and the people around me about what they're good for. And then it just clicked full circle. This is the medicine that I've been searching for. And fast forward again, moved to Trinidad and Tobago, which is where my father's from and where he grew up. My grandmother's still alive and she's 96, so I wanted to go back home and really dive deep into the medicine there. And I started interviewing elders in my family and also in South Trinidad, Orapooch, Barrackpore, Moruga, Princestown, and that's the basis of a lot of the information I have in my book. And not only what I've learned from elders, but I'm mixing my background in science and doing the scientific research and the personal accounts. For me, I don't talk about anything that I haven't used myself, and I think that's really important to embody these, these relationships with plants.
Oh, I love that so much. Oh, I know.
Thank you.
And you really do. You really do. I mean, in this book, you begin a little personal, and then you go into the plants, and then after every plant that she names, she talks about sort of the remedies that she believes it helps and that you've used yourself. Like, it's so personal, and it's just beautiful. I really love how you did this. Kaitlyn, you talked to her aunties. I didn't even know this. What is this connection? Because you did do a lot of research with herbalists for your book, yes?
I did do a lot of research, but this was a interview that happened like last year. So after Libertie had published, there is, well, you can talk about who they are, I guess, their farm and stuff. But it's an amazing farm that is on the lands where Harriet Tubman and her family and parents and also nieces and nephews were connected to that land, have been connected to that land. There's literally a tree on the land where the witness tree where Harriet Tubman would meet people to begin their journey up north to freedom. And so that is on the land. It's land owned by these two Black women elders. They are really protective of the land. They know the history. They know all about it. They also know everybody who's trying to get into the history and do whatever they want to do with it. They are really sort of like very clear and straight about the boundaries that are around it, while also having a very welcoming place to people who are coming there who want to commune with the land and do what you were doing, right? Really just two amazing people.
I love this connection. Did you guys know this beforehand?
Not till yesterday.
Donna, your book, The House of Plain Truth, is about a family of women who are responsible not only for burying their recently departed father, but also for finding long-lost siblings and deciding what to do with the family home. The home seems fairly insignificant until you tell us that the house and its upkeep has always been a headache, and that one of the sisters, Pauline, the one who has decided to retire in Jamaica after living in New York for most of her life, doesn't want to sell the land. Her sisters tell her that just about everything Papa planted here dies, but she remembers the callaloo bush, the peas they shelled as children, the coconut they sold in the market, the banana and plantain, and the guava trees. There's a real emotional attachment to the land and the memories attached to this land. Can you tell us a little bit about the importance of roots and land in your story?
Sure. But I guess first of all, for somebody who can't keep a plant alive, this is really important. It's really important to write about it. But
and by the way, there's plenty of plants on this cover, right?
has nothing to do with me. But sorry, what was your question?
I don't even know. The importance of roots and land in the story. Yeah,
Okay.
I helped Donna launch this book in DC, so I love this novel. So
Well, thank you. So I think a lot of it really goes back. I mean, I guess all of our heritage, all of our stories is really about the land, really about about farming. We were brought to the Caribbean, or most of us were brought to the Caribbean to farm, and I think largely because of the knowledge that we had, not just the strengths, the physical strengths, but I think there was so much that I think is missing from the story that is told about why we were brought to the Caribbean and to the Americas. Really had a lot to do with the knowledge that our ancestors had. So I think that, you know, like specifically for my family in particular, a lot of it, you know, my grandfather was a farmer, my grandmother sold some of the stuff that that they planted. My father studied at the Jamaica School of Agriculture. So I think farming, it skipped me. I mean, definitely skipped me. But that has been a part of my family, a part of all of our stories. But I think too that the other part of it is that we want to be rooted. We want to have a place that is ours. And I think that for all of us as Caribbean people, as we migrate and move around the world, I think we're always looking for and searching for that place that is ours. And I think that's one of the things that I did here, or try to do here in this book, is have Pearline look for and find that place. And for her, that place was that home, that place where she grew up, that her parents had held on to and got in various ways that, you know, we can ask whether it's truly theirs or not, but that was home. And so for Pearline, what really matters is having that place not just for herself, but for every other family member. This is a place where you're rooted and from which you cannot be removed.
You're making me think about something. This is completely off topic, but whatever. So, you know, my mother, I grew up in Baltimore, and we had a row house and very little strip of land, like in the back. Not much of a big yard, but like this woman would plant everything in this. You know, there's tomatoes, there's cucumbers, there's whatever. And I used to think, this is very odd. Nobody in our neighborhood was planting anything. And then she moves to Florida. And she begins to plant mango trees and avocado trees. And she complained the entire time she was doing this, how much work it was. I mean, nonstop. And she would package these little mangoes and she would mail them to me in Maryland. And, you know, and some of you, if you follow me on Instagram, you've seen me like open up my mango boxes, right? And I never thought about that, Donna, but I never thought about the need to sort of place herself, to like be reminded of home, to plant some soil, to like dig in the soil and claim something. Now I'm not going to give her such a hard time, like, but I'm feeling that. That's really, really important. Okay, so listen, I was in St. Lucia a few years ago. My daughter actually did some farming, some work with some Black women farmers there. And they were schooling us on plants and remedies. And while on this tour, there was another Black woman, and she was a doctor, and she was very skeptical. And she was whispering in my ear as we were doing this tour. And she was talking about, as the women were talking about teas and baths, and that they grew up with certain healing ailments, certain healing remedies, she began to sort of say, well, if we listened to them, we'd all be dead, you know. And I thought to myself, wow, this is so interesting, this sort of skepticism, what Western medicine will do to our, you know, sort of thinking about the things that we've even experienced in our own lives, right? And there's something that breeds skepticism in us, and a large part of that is religion. Very often, right? So Kaitlyn, Libertie's mother, lives on the fringe of this town. They trust her, and yet they don't. At the beginning of the story, Libertie's mother thinks she can heal this man who has clearly gone a little mad. His woman has died, and he's mourning her. And what Libertie's mother doesn't seem to understand is that this ailment can't really be healed if she's only focused on one aspect of him. Can you talk about Libertie's mother and what she maybe got wrong about the human condition, and how this whole episode made the community view her differently?
Yeah, so the character who she's trying to heal is named Mr. Ben, and he has just arrived in their community. He's escaped from slavery. So Libertie and her mother are born free. They've never experienced enslavement. And her mother is attempting to heal what we would probably now diagnose as PTSD and like intense traumatic response with medicine and with her understanding of 19th century psychology. And also because her lived experience is not that. And her lived experience, even though they are both Black people living in America in this particular time period, their lived experiences are so drastically different she cannot understand what's happening there. And so I wanted to give this character who clearly has done sort of impossible things. She's a black female doctor in the US in 1870, whatever. Like, she's done this really crazy, impossible, dramatic, heroic thing. But I wanted to give her a problem, a problem rooted in reality, that those things necessarily wouldn't even be able to touch, you know? And it's a problem that none of us can touch. We can't touch it today. I always wanted to write about sort of that conundrum of having somebody within your community who is deeply wounded, deeply hurt, and your community can sometimes find ways to heal that person, and sometimes, as hard as your community can try, or as much as you can feel like we're all in this together, you're not able to heal, or there's a disconnect there. And so I wanted to write about that sort of like gulp of absence, because part of it too was when I was doing my research, I was reading a lot about homeopathy, which is this form of medicine that came up in the 19th century that's essentially like cures like. You're using certain herbs to cure certain conditions. And abolitionists here in the US were fascinated with homeopathy. They use it so much. They were fascinated with all sorts of new medical inventions. They instinctively sort of understood that the medicine of the time was not helpful. And so they got really into homeopathy, they got really into water cures. Sojourner Truth got super into going to different water spas and trying to do water cures, trying to do these healings. But oftentimes they were people who, again, had lived through slavery, just gotten out of slavery, and were trying to find ways to heal around it, that maybe those things did help and maybe sometimes they did not. So I just found that incredibly poignant and also really relatable to our current time. I think about the people who I know in my life who have gone through a really huge disruption or really huge trauma, who are out there sort of seeking and looking. And I wanted to just talk about that part of being human and looking for those sorts of connections.
Yeah. And Donna, you and your community, when Pearline goes back home to Jamaica, there are these sisters, and they're all sort of together, arguing a little bit, but also sort of trying to heal a little bit of this fracture that's happened with the loss of a mother and loss of a father. Can you talk a little bit about community in your book?
Yeah, I think there are two different communities. One is the community in Cuba, and then the community in Jamaica. And so what happened with this family, for those of you who don't know, is the parents had migrated to Cuba in 1919 in the story. And the children were born in Cuba. There was, of course, a lot of upheaval, a lot of what we see today, where we are taking people and returning them to places that to their homeland for various reasons. So a lot of that happened during that time period in Cuba. And the family then returned to Jamaica, not necessarily with the wealth that they wanted to get when they moved to Cuba, but things were so bad that they just packed up and decided to go back. So there was that community that they had formed there.
Can I stop you 1 second? Because I don't think a lot of people know how many West Indians actually went to Cuba to work on the land. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yes, I don't remember the numbers, but it was a significant number of people, definitely, and I can talk particularly about Jamaica, but throughout the entire Caribbean. A lot of what happened after slavery was abolished, a number of people moved from the English-speaking Caribbean to Panama to work on the canal. And as the canal work started drying up and that ended, people then began moving away from Panama towards, mostly in Cuba and also in Costa Rica, to work both tobacco and sugarcane fields there. And as we see when people begin moving into new neighbors or new countries, there is a lot of upheaval. And we're talking about people who were not moving anywhere illegally. They were invited to Cuba because a lot of the American companies that were there in Cuba needed a workforce to work their sugarcane fields. And so in Jamaica at that time, I don't remember what the numbers were, but people, let's say you were making $1 like a day in Jamaica. In Cuba, you would make double that amount or sometimes triple that amount. So people were looking for ways to, one, make themselves better, improve their families, and so they went to Cuba. So a lot of what happened then as the sugarcane industry, or the price of sugar plummeted, or like there were wars, there were various issues happening. The people who were blamed for anything that happened in Cuba were, of course, the migrants, and of course the darker skinned people, because Cuba in the 1800s, late 1800s, were trying to import people from Spain to lighten the race. So of course, when you had a number of black people moving in, there was all the same issues. Everything that you hear today about immigrants is exactly what you heard then. So we have come full circle, just in a different country. Or again, well, shouldn't say in a different country, because we had the same thing here, but it's just so much of the same thing everywhere you turn. So that was what Pearline's family was fleeing when they left Cuba and decided to go back to Jamaica. And so there was a community that they had formed, or all these migrants had formed in Cuba, that really reflected the countries that they came from. And I think even today, if you go to Cuba, there are still some English-speaking sections or people who can trace their roots back to Jamaica or various other countries in the English-speaking Caribbean. But also, when the family came back to Jamaica, they then had to form a new community, or had to, I guess, become or be in community with other people who they didn't necessarily know or didn't grow up with. But I think, one of the things that we talked about on the panel before this was also this idea of going back home. And so for Pearline, leaving, she had lived in Brooklyn for like 30 years. She was going back home to sisters who had their own little bond. And so as the third member in this family, she felt a little bit left out, because she is coming into ideas and issues and concerns that were not necessarily hers, because she was living somewhere else. So I think, this whole idea of movement and community, there are so many aspects of it. And family is itself a community with its own little problems sometimes, helps and hurts. And I think that's a lot of what Pearline was coming into and finding when she decided to go back to Jamaica.
Yeah, thank you. I want to jump back to the spiritual stuff, Aleya, if you don't mind. You mentioned that through plants, that plants are not divorced from spiritual tradition. Since slavery, there was a fear of this sort of practice. You talk about that in your book. Can you talk about ways cultivating a life that's closer to the earth's healing powers is not antithetical to religion?
Most people, not most people, I would say a lot of people read me as someone who just believes in the earth, or just believes in stars, and all of those things are what I stand for, because I believe in living with the rhythms of the earth, but I'd never have divorced that from God and a higher power as well. So I try to blend all of that into my book and into my work. You mentioned how there's certain elements that are beyond plants and beyond community. They have this deeper root, and I try to make that clear in my book as well, that plants, just like Western medicines, can just be a Band-Aid. And at the end of the day, there's always a root cause to illness. It's usually, especially in Caribbean herbalism and indigenous knowledge and African knowledge, there's always a spiritual root cause to these things. And until you address that, the herbs are only going to do but so much. So I never want people to think, these are just some blanket remedies. Like, I always want people to dig deeper onto the spiritual side of things, that they can, as much as they can help. And that's the hard work. That's what people aren't really ready for. They want the Band-Aid. They want the silver bullet. And I talk about how, with plants, the silver bullet also doesn't come if you don't work with the plants, you don't build a relationship with them. And I think that's the spiritual aspect of it all as well. Like, you have, just like with God, you have to build a relationship with God if you want the higher power to work for you and your greatest good. And the same is with the plants. So, yeah.
What does that mean?
What does what mean?
What does that mean, building a relationship with the plants? Like, so, I'm taking something and and someone says, oh, this will work. Because we have that, all of us have that, right? Those moments where like somebody's aching something and 20 people tell you, you should take this and you should take that, right? And sometimes you listen, and sometimes you're sort of attuned, and you're like, oh, anything to kind of ease my suffering, anything to sort of ease my pain. Do I have to really fully believe that this thing is going to heal me in order for it to heal me? Like, that's what I'm asking.
It's, no one really wants to talk about it, but there's plenty of scientific studies about placebo effects and the power of belief. And that works with Western medicine as well. But with plants, we have to believe. And we come from a culture that believed in it. So our grandmothers, our grandfathers, our aunties and uncles, they instilled that belief, but that belief has been divorced, and people are skeptical now because Western medicine has put a wedge in there, and now we have a new belief system. That's the God, that's what people believe in. So with building a relationship with plants, to me that means, someone yesterday talked about how do you know a place or a person if you don't know the mundane, and for me that's the same with plants. Like, I don't want to just know what it's good for. I want to know how many petals there are. I want to know what pollinators come to it. I want to know what seasons it grows in. And once I know those things, then I can better integrate it into my life. And not everyone has the time or the wherewithal. That's why we do have healers and people that you go to who build those relationships. But my goal with this book is trying to make this information and this cultural knowledge more accessible so that we do know that we can build these relationships. We can look at plants, observe them, grow them, watch them, grow through the seasons just like we watch, our children grow and use them for our greater good.
I love that. I was thinking when you were talking about sort of the way that I came through my first book was sort of reaching for my grandmother, like she had gotten sick, and I was really like trying to figure out what her story was, like coming to this country and then, building a life here that then ended up sort of, me benefiting from. And as you were talking, I was thinking about how important it might have been, and I lost this opportunity, but how important it might have been to actually talk to her about the one thing that seemed to animate her, right? These plants on her windowsill in Brooklyn, right? These things that she was growing in the kitchen or on the fire escape, actually. And so, I'm thinking about your relationship going back home to be with your grandmother. Can you tell us a little bit about that relationship?
Yeah. I actually have been visiting and planning to move to Trinidad since around 2017. And in March 2020, March 11th, I landed for a 3-month trip. And we all know what happened around March 16th, 17th. The borders in Trinidad shut down for over a year. And I was the only one to be there for my grandmother at that moment. My father, who's in the audience, he goes back and forth a lot. My aunts go back and forth a lot. But in that moment, it was just me and her, in Trinidad. And it was just, it just brought everything full circle, why I do what I do, why I listen to Spirit and God, and how it moves me through this world. And so my grandmother has dementia. She's 96, so she remembers me for the most part whenever, we having conversations. But one thing she always remembers is her plants. She might not know who the neighbor is anymore. She might not remember, that her mother's even not alive anymore. But if you ask her how to use ratchet, if you ask her how to use buacano, if you ask her how to use aloes, those are the things she can still remember and tell me. So, and not just her, all elders, like you said, that's what animates them. That's what animates your mother, the people in your books. We have to ask them these questions. And in my book, I talk about how to build a relationship with elders and how to ask these questions, because it's not easy, They're discerning. They're looking at you what do you want to know this for? How are you going to use this information? And, being reciprocal, not just going in and saying, what's this good for? It's my favorite first question to ask people when I'm interviewing them is, what's your favorite bush tea? And then that activates. They're telling me about their mother. They're telling me about their, who they healed with lemongrass, and then the conversation starts flowing. So, yeah.
I love that. Donna, what's your favorite bush?
Oh, Lord.
You don't have to answer.
No, ginger tea cures everything. Anything beyond that, I don't know.
One of the questions this book festival organizers, Marcia and others, pose is how do we keep loving in a collapsing world? What's true in all these books is a bit of dislocation, but also what's true is a collapse of an ecosystem. I don't know about you, but that seems to be an ever-present thing for me. Pearline is trying to return home to this land that has never met expectations, and in that end, she can't really own it. Kaitlyn, your Libertie, says she loves Haiti, but she sees an underbelly of a world in Haiti, this place of liberation that she finds really horrid in some respects, too. And Aleya, you're connecting with your ancestral home through working with plants on a planet that is literally overheating. I like to say that we in the Caribbean have been taught to do, not to waste, which you said, right? To conserve, reuse, repurpose. All these environmentalists have been telling us this for a couple of decades, but we've been doing it at home all along, right? We've been taught to do this from the very first minute that we've been like growing up, right? Turn off the water, reuse everything, you know, find a reason for even the husk of something, right? And so living simply, like Pearline wants to do, and living off our own efforts, and land like Libertie and those you study, Aleya, have been essential elements in our survival. How do we keep reaching towards these sorts of understandings when the ground beneath us, literally, as well as its roots, seem to be shifting, when the world around us seems to be falling apart? And that's a question for all of you all. And sorry to end on a really deep, dark note, but I'm hoping you can say something hopeful.
Yeah, I was interviewed for a pretty famous farmer named Leah Penniman in the States. She has a book called Black Earth Wisdom, and I'm interviewed in that book talking about seeds and change. And for me, it shouldn't even be controversial to me at this point, but I'm not scared of climate changing, of the end that we think is coming, or to me it's just a new beginning. And I also don't think we can have the power to destroy the earth. Like, the earth has been here, it's gonna be here. If anything, humans might get knocked off, but you know. At the end of the day, like, the earth is gonna keep breathing, and the plants will adapt. And what I find hope in and resilience is that adaptability and the resilience of the plants that I'm growing. Like, when I can take some seeds from Trinidad, which are used to a warm, humid climate, bring them up to Maryland and grow them on my farm on the Eastern Shore, which I used to do a lot of, and I would see how some of them wouldn't survive and some would. And then you keep working with the plants until they adapt, and then they become more resilient to their environment. I think of Octavia Butler, God is change, and that is the one constant, is change. And we are so resistant to that as humans, and we want to fight against it, you know. Climate is changing, so let's do all this weird stuff to the environment to like reverse it. There's no reversing. We just have to, you know, keep living, keep growing, and yeah, the growth gives me hope, and yeah.
So no fear?
No.
Okay, done.
So I think I come back to story. And both family stories and just our story in general. Because I think that so much of what we see now is this kind of attempt to erase who we are, to erase our stories, to erase our histories, to erase our legacy, our legacies. And I think that we are the ones who hold those stories, and we need to tell them in whatever ways we can, and continue to tell them. The other thing too that I keep coming back to, and that I use as the way to give me hope, is something that Toni Morrison said about racism. And you know, it's basically that the real reason for racism is to keep us talking about that, to keep us not just defending who we are, but making people see us as people, as human beings, and that keeps us from doing the real work. And so I think for me, a part of that is really just telling those stories, to keep writing, to do that work, as opposed to just continuing to try to make somebody else see that I belong here, that I belong anywhere, or that I should be doing those things. I am just doing it. And I think that the more we actually do that, put ourselves out there, put our work out there, make sure that it is seen, whatever that work is, whether it's planting, whether it's writing fiction, or telling our stories on film, just doing that work and putting it there. making it remain exactly there in front of everybody in people's eyes.
Donna, when you're writing, I've read your books, all of your books, I think, well, all the published ones, and I'm curious. Are you thinking of invoking the land every time you're writing? Is it intentional, or is it just what we're doing, what we do because of where we're from?
Probably what we do because of where we're from.
Yeah.
And I think, I'm trying to think, I mean, there's water involved in everything that I write so far. And it really takes a lot to not, I keep trying not to, but it keeps coming back. No matter what I do, there's water in there. And I think a lot of that really is a part of who we are, a part of who I am. You know, growing up in Jamaica, I grew up in a small town, Brownstown, 8 miles from Discover Bay, the sea. And I could not swim when I was a child, but I learned how to swim. But water was, you know, it was a part of our lives, and the land as well. And I don't think that even if I do write about a city, I think there's still going to be some aspect of the land, some aspect of, you know, like plants that's part of those stories.
Yeah, yeah. Kaitlyn, do you remember the question?
Sure.
Okay.
About the end of the world.
The end of the world.
I think a lot about how so much, like, maybe like 10 years ago, I guess, like when Walking Dead and sort of like all these pop culture representations of like apocalypse and end of the world and all these sorts of things, it was all about individuals. It was like, okay, the way to do this is to hoard as much as you can, and then you'll just be in your bunker with your family, and that's how you'll survive. And it was like, if that's how we survive, take me out. I don't want that way of surviving. You know, I think the way that I look towards building community and sort of rejecting the idea that the point is for individuals to survive, because that's not how we're going to survive, especially as people of the African diaspora. That's not how we will survive as individuals. That's like anathema to so much of both how we move through this world, our history, and then also our culture. So for me, it is building the practices of community as much as possible and rejecting the parts of our culture that say, you know, focus just on yourself, or just focus on just the part of your family that's cool, not the part of your family that's like going to be a little bit annoying, or just focus on the easiest people in your life. I think as much as we can build that muscle of how do I maintain, you know, my safety, my personal integrity, but also build community maybe with people who I am not 100% aligned with. And that I speak about this, it's actually very hard for me to do. It's really hard for me to think about it that way, and I see that really as like a pressure point, especially as we move forward, because we're the only way that we will survive in a way that feels real and actual thriving and pleasurable is if we are in larger communities, if we are in communities. And to bring it back to Libertie, like that was a huge question when I was writing that book, was this question of like, what is a community and what do we do with the parts of our community that maybe we don't fully agree with? You know, like Libertie goes to Haiti, she falls in love with the country, but she's part of a community of Black expats who moved there in the 19th century, who are essentially going into that community as colonizers. They're trying to change it. And she doesn't feel aligned with that. She's saying this is wrong. So then what community do you actually belong to in that sort of instance, and how do you build alliances and relationships that are actually going to sustain you, is like an ever-present question.
I hear people say this a lot, and I believe everything you just said. I do. I mean, fundamentally, but there is this other thing, and you kind of said it, where, you know, we are pulled toward this sort of close up. Be on your own, keep everyone at bay. And so I guess I want to ask each of you, like, what does that practice really look like for you? Like, what does it mean to be, quote, in community? Because, you know, if we look at what's happening right now in our streets, you know, I live in DC for, you know, as someone said earlier, occupied DC right now, right? And I remember when they began sort of, you know, when this administration began sort of snatching people off the street. Now, the election had just happened, and, you know, we are considered part of the 90%, I would assume, the ones who voted against this current administration. And there were a lot of us who were online saying, not my business. I did my job, right? I'm done. I'm going to sort of pull back now and let these people handle this. But as we begin to see, it just gets worse and worse, and now they're right at our heels. It's no longer them and us, right? Though many of us could see this coming. Like, you didn't have to be a genius to see that this was actually what was intended in the first place. But what does it look like? And I know we weren't meant to get political, but we're going to get political. So what does it look like to be really in community and not just talking it, but doing it every day? How about you, Aleya?
For me, I mean, land is the basis of my community and community in general, and it's why it was way easier in the past to be in community, because we were on a piece of land that we needed many people to work to survive. Right now, we have 20 acres of land in Trinidad, and there's no way me and my husband and daughter could do that alone, you know? So we have to rely on people to be looking out for the land so people aren't stealing, to help us cut grass, to help watch our daughter when we're working it. So it's naturally built in. And if you can't get a piece of land to build a community, then you have to, search for other ways. Like, you have to lean on people, you have to ask them questions, you have to really get to know them. I've been a part of a few different land collectives, farming collectives. I've tried to buy land in groups together. We've leased land together, just different iterations of it. And what always came up was, if we don't love each other like family, this isn't gonna work. Yeah. And that's the hard part nowadays. Like, we're so isolated. Capitalism rightfully isolates us fully because we're just trying to make enough money to pay our bills. But when you really slow down to the rhythm of the land, to the earth, and realize that you're held and you have what you need, then you can really love on people. And I think that's what's missing, and that's what's needed. Whether you're in the countryside or you're in the city, how are we loving on people and getting to know them so that we can love them like family, and so that when times get rough, you know who's gonna give you your avocados and your shadow benny. And now we live in a society where not everyone's gonna be land-based, but there's so many roles in a community. So maybe part of the work is us all figuring out what is our passion, what is our role, and then coming together with people who have different passions and roles to figure it out together.
Yeah, I like that.
I'm moving with her.
That's right.
Exactly.
Can we just have a little bit of space?
Half an acre each.
I would just say, you're saying, know your role. I think that's the starting place, right? Like, that frustration that you were talking about earlier that so many people expressed right after the election of I'm done, I'm not going to help anymore, is partly because Black women in particular in this country are asked to take on multiple roles, oftentimes expecting people to be an expert in things that we don't have an expert around. You're a Black woman, you must be able to talk about this. But if you know your role, if you know the role that you can actually do that feels good for you, that you have knowledge around, that you can offer to, that you can do generously, then all of that stuff becomes at least slightly less intense, and less the feeling that you have to be a superhero to save everybody. Because I can't, nobody on their own can save everybody, that's just not a thing that's possible. But if I know that the thing that I can offer is this particular service or this particular understanding or this particular thing, and the generosity that comes with that, so that I don't necessarily feel oh my God, someone's gonna ask me for this, and then what am I gonna do over here or whatever, you are able to have that back and forth reciprocity that you were talking about that's necessary for a community to happen.
Does that mean writing for you?
I mean, that's very convenient, right? My role is just to be pretty and over here. So I try to think about it a little bit more of okay, so if it is writing or communication, then that means most of that role is going to have to be listening. So that's going to be the hard part. It means you are shutting up, you're listening to other people, and you're listening even to people who you do not agree with or who are saying things that you think are wrong. That's very hard for me. But you're going to have that, then that's your role. The role is not necessarily sitting here and publishing stuff. The core of that role is to be a listener, and like you were saying, to listen to stories, to have those conversations, and have the difficult conversations, not just sort of the fun ones where you're sort of vibing back and forth.
I like that.
Yeah.
Donna?
Yeah, it's something that I keep thinking about, and And I don't know that I have the answer to it yet. In 2016, when we had the first bout with this disaster, you know, one of the first things I kept saying is that I'm moving. I'm going back to Jamaica. And, you know, various things happened and I stayed. I'm still here. And again, I'm back to that place. You know, like, where do I move to? Do I go back to Jamaica? And if I go back to Jamaica right now, you know, like, what do I do? And, you know, so there's so many things for me that, you know, like, that this whole thing brings up. You know, like, where is my community? Who are my people? How do I find them? And what is my role? And so part of that role, of course, is telling those stories and is listening, trying to listen, not necessarily agreeing with the people I don't agree with. I don't want to hear it. There's some things I don't want to hear. I'm not entertaining that. But I think there certainly is a role for that, that I have to be able to, or we have to be able to find a way, not necessarily to fully entertain, but to reach other people. And I think that as writers, that is a part of our role that I don't know that I have fully yet figured out how I make that actual part of it work. Are the stories that I'm telling now relevant to what is happening today? Do I need to be writing something different to reflect what is happening today? And so it's something that I continue to think about, what my role is and how I fit into where we are today. And I don't know. I don't know what it's going to take for me to actually. I think it's going to happen, and I will know it when it happens. But I don't, right now, I wouldn't be able to tell you that I have the exact answer to it.
Yeah, a lot of us are feeling like that. Okay, I'm going to open it up to questions, but I have one last thing for Aleya, if you don't mind, because Donna just made me think about something. You did something that many of us think about doing, which is going back home, right? And what has home given to you in these last couple of years since you just decided? I mean, you've picked up you grew up in Baltimore, Maryland, went to school there, and then decided to go back. Were you born in Trinidad?
No, I was born here too.
American born, decided to go and live and how has that been? What does that look like for you?
Yeah, I mean, I always tell people it's not romantic, you know. It's beautiful. It's what I was supposed to do, so it's what I'm doing. But it's definitely not easy all the time. And for me, what makes it beautiful, it makes it easier, is the stories, the familiar stories that have been unearthed since I've been there, like that have given me more purpose, like. You know, my grandmother telling me about her father, who was a farmer for Orapooch, and he grew rice and grew all these things that I'm doing now. Like, I didn't know, me and my husband, we do chocolate and farm cocoa. My father didn't tell me until I moved to Trinidad that he grew up dancing cocoa and picking cocoa. So it just brought it all full circle for me. And I think when you do go home, you know, there's more a sense of purpose that you can gain by listening to those stories and unearthing. Like, you might find out, you know, your great grandmother had a journal that was, you know, all these writings that, you know, she wanted to be a writer, and then you find that out, and that makes everything starts to make more sense. So, yeah, I recommend it, and I also say it's not easy.
Okay, questions. And if you can just wait for the mic to come to you. I have one here. Thank you.
I loved this panel so much. Thank you. Thank you for sharing your wisdom. I'll say I work in climate tech, so I think about ecological collapse all the time, and I too am very optimistic. And at the end of the day, it all comes down to plants. And like, there's no world if there are not trees or plankton. Like, we can't breathe without the oxygen, so it's all about plants. So I love that this was all about plants. Where am I going with this? In climate tech, my focus is on food and farming, so food and agriculture, farming. And I live here, but I'm from Trinidad, I'm Trini, completely. And I think a lot about food in the Caribbean and food sovereignty or food security. And in the Caribbean, there are two really interesting stories. Guyana is the only food sovereign country in the entire world. In part because there's a lot of land, a lot of fertile land, and the population is small enough that you can feed everyone. Trinidad is the complete opposite. I found out a couple of days ago for Emancipation Day, 80% of food in Trinidad is imported. That's insane. So I guess as you're talking or thinking about farming, doing your research for your work or your books, what does it mean to become more food sovereign in the Caribbean? How do we get back into farming, especially considering all of the people in the Caribbean, Afro-Caribbean, Indo-Caribbean, like you're brought here to farm? It kind of makes sense that you want, I don't know, a respite from that. At the same time, we all have to eat, and we have great food and great land. How, I don't know, what are your thoughts there? How do we become more food secure, more food sovereign?
Yeah, I mean, it's a really, really big question. Farming in the States, I was part of food sovereignty movements, agroecology movements, and one of the biggest things we worked on was like the political education around farming and why it's important. Like, why is having land powerful? Why is feeding yourself powerful? And once you realize that, like, you start to heal some trauma. Like, we called it post-traumatic slavery disorder, which is a reason why a lot of us don't want to, do that hard work on the land. We don't want to remember, what that meant in the past. But like I said about, farming on the land where Harriet Tubman was, like, there's a reclamation that's happening, and we need to reclaim these stories and these histories. At the same time, I don't think most people do anything until there's a collapse. Most people aren't ready to change until they have to change. And right now in the Caribbean, we're on the brink of that. And you're seeing, especially in Trinidad, like, whether, there's plenty of problems with the government programs around farming, but they're trying to, like, re-energize the youth and have youth farming programs, and because we're on the brink of a collapse within the food system. So you look at a place like Cuba, who once sanctions got put on them, they had to become more food secure. They had to change their farming systems. People wonder when will people go back to organic, when the chemicals are too expensive to buy, and when we have to do it. I wish there was a way that we could do that before the collapse, but like myself and many people like me and friends of mine are just there, trying to do the work until then, to remind people that it's possible.
And what is possible too is sort of what my mother does, right? Like, just that little strip that you have, you can actually feed yourself even a small percentage of like what you eat,
and inspire people who pass by,
and give it to your neighbors and create community. I mean, there's real like value in that, and I don't think that we always appreciated that. Can you pass the microphone to the young man in the red cap right here? Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, this was a very enthralling panel. Things close to my heart, which is food. I am a sustainability and resilience consultant, working on all different types of things. It sounds big, but but these days we are focusing on food security and food security and food sovereignty. I'd like to talk to Aleya because I have two concerns here. One is developing food security and food sovereignty within the Caribbean, the entire Caribbean. And two, I have a question about healing. Western medicine, homeopathy, or a hybrid.
Western medicine or what?
Homeopathy, the
Or hybrid.
plants and herbs. Or a hybrid, right? I get into a lot of deep arguments because I also grew up in Trinidad with my grandmother. And under her bleach was the pharmacy, right? The Wonder the World leaf, the shining bush, the lemongrass, whatever we had, she would tell you what corner the bleach to find it, and it worked. I have never been into Western medicine as such because I don't like chemicals and drugs. But I get into arguments that some of us die because we don't adopt Western medicine. Now, I have some friends who went to medical school and pharmacy school and whatever. And I asked them, I say, how many nutrition courses you have done in your 8 years of medical school? None. So that's part of the, so that's part of my answer. Because I believe food heals, right? Now, Aleya, you have an additional twist to it where it's also the spirituality behind things, and that intrigues me. So I definitely need to get your book. And I'm really, really excited about all the other stories about going back home and how you fix family and motherhood. So I don't think I have a question, but the only question was about the medicine part of it. So if you can help me with that.
Okay. Yeah, they're not divorced from each. Like Western medicine comes from traditional medicine. I always, in my book, whenever I talk about the modern research, I'm like, oh, look, the modern research is corroborating what your grandmother always knew. The issue is we're not funding that research because you can't patent plants and all of those things. But I do feel strongly that these things need to be researched in a way that can be more accessible. Like, I don't think, everyone can't grow fit weed or wonder of the world in their yard. And there's a role of Western medicine of like distilling the compounds and making it safe and accessible to people. And I struggle with that a little bit too. But recently I was in Barbados at an ethnobotany conference. And I find ethnobotany as a study of plants and people. It brings together the medical doctor, the nutritionist, the chemist, the traditional healers, and all of those people need to be in the room together more often so that we can come up with, the next step. Like, go, listen to our grandmothers is what we need to do, and we need to keep building upon that knowledge. And I don't think we just stop at, bush tea and bush baths. We can keep building. We can, and by honoring our ancestors in the past, just keep building upon that knowledge in different ways. So, yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. I think of what a lot of the work you're doing as building maroon spaces, spaces where there's healing inside but protected from the outside. So the work that you're doing with whether it's preserving stories or preserving culture or preserving seeds or is the healing inside. But I want to talk a little bit about protecting from the outside because whether it's unjust laws, unethical laws, there are attacks on the land, right? So we know that in Maroon country in Jamaica, there is an attack on their land with extraction and people wanting to extract bauxite from it. Some of us are from Caribbean islands where everybody has access to beaches and some of us are not, from Jamaica. From your research, what work have you come across? How are people protecting from the attacks from outside, whether it's eminent domain or other attacks from the outside to preserve the land?
That's a tough one. I'm an attorney and a writer, and one of the interesting things, and I've also recently written a book about South Africa, and as many of you know, we have white refugees from South Africa here. But what was interesting about when Mandela was elected in South Africa, one of the criticisms was that he worked on the social part but didn't work on the economic part. Like he gave up the economic power and let it remain in the hands of the oppressors, of the colonizers, and that is what we're seeing today, right? We're seeing sort of the high unemployment rate. We're seeing the continued ownership. 90+% of the land in South Africa is still owned by whites, and it is almost impossible for that country to reverse some of the legacy of colonialism by not actually having the land. And so for me, the law becomes a very important part. Like we actually have to use our legal channels to reclaim land again. And I don't necessarily know how that's always done, particularly in this country where the law doesn't mean that much anymore. But to me, that is how we have to do it. We can't undo necessarily this without legal assistance. It feels to me like I can't figure out another way for that to get undone. And that means actually like like a rewrite of laws. I mean, you know, they did it in Zimbabwe, right? And it wasn't done particularly well because there was an effort to take the land back without actually having some sort of recompense. And so we have to figure out some way to bring equity back into the laws that clearly were written without us in mind. But I don't know if anyone else has any thoughts on that.
Well, I think looking at it from the perspective of Jamaica, what I think that we need to do is really take a step back and look at tourism. And how we approach tourism and how much reliance we want to have on tourism. So I think that's where I can say definitely in Jamaica, that's where a lot of our issues around land come into play. Because so much of the land right now, particularly along the coast, is just being given over to tourists, where we really cannot access most of the beaches, where we are destroying wetlands to build yet more hotels. And there's just so much focus on on developing our country for people who come in and spend a week or 2 or 3 days.
Well, you just reminded me of something, because in Anguilla, in Anguilla, very often the Black Anguillans will not sell that land.
I think it's in their
And
legal code.
it is in their legal code, exactly. And so they actually built that into their law, where, and I think it's like a certain percentage of land has to be actually owned by, you know, indigenous Anguillans or, you know, Black Anguillans, and so they put it into their laws, and you know, and you do wonder whether something like that could be helpful. I mean, Jamaica is a really, really prime example of having given your country over to capitalism, right? Anyone else?
I can say that point that you just made about Anguilla. I think a lot of countries now are doing that globally. And you think in Cape Verde, in Sri Lanka, and a lot of other places, you have to be a national of the country. So what people do is they get a partner and have these countries, to your point, like what Anguilla just did, is that I would just find a partner to that country and buy the land and build a hotel or whatever establishment I need to. So I really don't, it's a front at the end of the day. You know, but in Cape Verde, for example, if you were to build a property, you cannot bring an outsider to come and work. You know, and I think in that aspect, then it holds true to building community, bringing back what we have. You know, a lot of the hotels that you go to, you're eating indigenous food. It's not what's imported. And I think that is how we see it.
Yeah, I love that, yeah. But you know, that's also about community, right? I mean, one of the things too is you're right, there's a way to always skirt the law. But we have to be the ones to hold the integrity, right? We have to be the ones to say we're not going to sell our land to this person, and that if somebody's coming, they have to have the intentions of sort of saving our land. And it's our responsibility. This is our land. You know, and it's our responsibility to hold it. And you know, so many of us and we see it in inner cities all the time, right? They come and they got a big fat check, and they give it to you for your, you know, for your little Harlem brownstone. Think about Harlem, right? So it's over and over and over again. And at some point, we have to realize that this is a repetitive system that keeps happening. And what are the end results? We're here now.
There's another question.
Okay, I think one more. Yeah.
Hello, thank you for your wisdom. It's so great to hear about your books. I spent most of my time in the States undocumented. Some of my family is still undocumented. I always think about, you know, we're talking about root voice, and I don't know, I'm always thinking about how undocumented people can still be connected to a land that they cannot go home to at the moment. And I always think about, you know, I've seen, you know, my stepfather and my mother, like, you know, the way they even like their eyes light up when they like go to Pioneer and they find Shadow Benny, you know, or they go, you know, to the market on Flatbush and they find Shadow Benny, or they've learned to replace some ingredient, you know, with an ingredient that's most close to, you know, what they used to use back home. I always see them really light up with that. and also, sharing stories, about plants and, even stories that I think that kind of don't make sense to me about how a plant spoke to them, but which I've learned to honor. So I guess my question to you is like, what are some ways that, for folks who cannot be physically tied to the land, or their hope of, being tied to the land in the future, or going back home, this idea of going back home is not a possibility. What are some options, internally, maybe in their community that they can do? Yeah.
Read our books.
I was going to say.
That's not a bad one. I like it.
Yeah. That reading, it puts you in a place, like using your imagination to take you back there. I'm just so grateful that they've written, like, historical fiction to me is so important, because when you go into when you read these history books and we're not in there, or the way that the story is told isn't how you know it to be true by your intuition, we rely on authors to create that world that we know is true. And and you mentioned it too, like the food, the plants, like if you're able to connect yourself to your land of your birth through what you're eating, what you're growing in your windowsill, you'll always feel that connection to home for sure. And recognizing the analogs, the things here that relate.
There's a lot of power in that. Yeah. Thank you all so much. We appreciate it.
Thank you.
Love you.
Thank you, everyone, for all of that. Okay, so there'll be book signing right outside. Please grab your copies and then meet the authors at the cafe, just before the cafe, to sign their books, because you all are buying all the books. Because the Center for Fiction has to invite us back next year.